The message didn't arrive loudly. It didn't need to. It came wrapped in symbols that were meant to be understood without explanation, symbols designed to travel faster than fear and settle deeper. This wasn't a random act of intimidation. It was deliberate, calculated, and timed to make a point before anyone could respond. Targeting Bumpy Johnson's brother wasn't about him personally. It was about proximity, about signaling that no distance was safe, that family could be reached when the man himself could not. The intent was clear: provoke rage, force a public reaction, drag Harlem into a spectacle that would justify whatever came next. The threat was meant to corner him emotionally, to turn patience into weakness and restraint into hesitation. Everyone who heard about it expected the same thing: an immediate response, loud and unmistakable. That was the trap. What made this moment dangerous wasn't the threat itself, but what it was trying to trigger. Fear was only the surface. Beneath it was an invitation to lose control, and that invitation was far more deadly than the message ever could be. This wasn't the kind of threat Harlem dealt with every day. Street violence followed familiar rules: territory disputes, money disagreements, personal insults that escalated into predictable outcomes. Everyone knew how those conflicts moved, how they ended, and who they usually stayed between. This was something else. The message carried ideology, not impulse. It wasn't about taking control of a corner or settling a score. It was meant to send fear outward, beyond one man, beyond one family, and into an entire neighborhood. That difference mattered. Street violence burns fast and draws clear lines. This kind of threat was designed to linger, to provoke spectacle, and to invite a response that could be used as justification. An immediate reaction would have played directly into that design. Loud retaliation would shift the story away from the threat itself and onto Harlem's response. That was the danger. This wasn't about winning a confrontation. It was about avoiding a narrative that others were eager to write. Recognizing that distinction was the first step toward control. Going after his brother wasn't accidental, and it wasn't personal in the way people assumed. It was strategic. Family wasn't just emotional leverage. It was the one place where calculation could be tested. The brother wasn't a soldier, wasn't a decision-maker, wasn't someone who moved pieces on the board. That was exactly why he was chosen. Targeting him shifted the conflict from business to blood. It forced a different kind of response. Pride, anger, and obligation all collided in the same space. Anyone else might have reacted instantly, not because it was smart, because it felt necessary. That was the pressure point. The message behind the threat was clear. We can't reach you directly, but we can reach what you protect. It was meant to make restraint feel like betrayal and patience feel like weakness. Every hour that passed without a response made people whisper. Some mistook the silence for uncertainty. They didn't understand that this wasn't hesitation. It was containment. Protecting family didn't require noise. It required control. And control, in moments like this, had to come before emotion, or everything would unravel at once. What unsettled people most wasn't the threat itself. It was the absence of a reaction. Hours passed, then a day. No public statement, no visible retaliation, no signal meant for outsiders to read. In a place where responses were usually instant, the delay felt unnatural. Everyone assumed something was wrong. They didn't see what was happening beneath the surface. Silence wasn't indecision. It was selection. Choosing when to act was just as important as choosing how. An immediate response would have satisfied emotion, but it would have surrendered control. It would have made the threat the center of the story instead of the mistake behind it. By not reacting, the situation was allowed to reveal itself. People talked. Patterns emerged. Intent became clearer. Time did what anger could not. It separated noise from truth. That choice confused enemies and unsettled allies, but it served one purpose above all else. It shifted the timeline. Once time was controlled, every Day one passed without incident, and that absence unsettled everyone paying attention. No retaliation, no warning shots, no sudden movement meant to reassure allies or intimidate enemies. In Harlem, that kind of stillness after a threat felt unnatural. People expected noise, because noise was how fear was usually answered. But nothing came. That silence did something important. It disrupted expectations. Those who issued the threat began to question whether they had miscalculated. Allies wondered if something larger was already in motion. Rumors started, but none of them landed on certainty. Uncertainty spread faster than fear could. Doing nothing on the first day wasn't about patience for its own sake. It was about observation. Who talked? Who stayed quiet? Who suddenly became visible? When there's no reaction, people reveal themselves trying to explain the silence. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. The lack of response wasn't calming the situation, it was tightening it. The threat hadn't been forgotten, it was being studied, and one had already begun to shift. While fear waited for something loud to happen, information moved quietly. Conversations shifted behind closed doors. Names were mentioned carefully, then avoided. People listened more than they spoke. In places where panic usually spread first, something else took its place. Attention. Every movement was noted. Who showed up where they didn't usually belong? Who suddenly stopped being seen? Who asked questions that didn't match their position? Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. The absence of chaos allowed patterns to surface without distortion. Information has an advantage. Fear doesn't. It accumulates. Each small detail connected to another, forming a clearer picture of intent, support, and overconfidence. The people behind the threat assumed silence meant uncertainty. They didn't realize silence had created space to observe them without resistance. By the time anyone sensed they were being watched, it was already too late to change course. Fear reacts outward. Information moves inward, collecting leverage quietly. And once leverage exists, volume becomes unnecessary. Control doesn't need to announce itself when it already knows where everything stands. By the second day, confidence began to creep in where caution should have lived. Silence was mistaken for uncertainty. The absence of retaliation felt, to some, like an opening rather than a warning. When nothing happens fast, people start believing nothing is coming at all. That assumption was the mistake. Those behind the threat began to relax their guard. Movements grew careless, conversations less guarded. The tension they had expected to provoke never arrived, and without resistance to push against, their own discipline slipped. Silence created space, and in that space, overconfidence took root. What they didn't understand was that silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means nothing is being revealed. Every unchecked assumption became another loose thread, every careless move to see. The danger wasn't that no response was coming. The danger was that the response no longer needed to announce itself. By believing they had been ignored, they stopped hiding. And once that happened, the outcome stopped being uncertain. By the time the third day passed, the absence of chaos had done something unexpected. It dulled urgency. Police attention follows patterns. Sirens, reports, bodies, noise. None of that appeared. No public retaliation, no street-level disorder, nothing that demanded an immediate response or justified increased presence. Without escalation, concern softened into routine. A threat without aftermath is easy to downgrade. Files stay thin, conversations move on, resources are redirected elsewhere. What isn't visible slowly stops being prioritized. That quiet worked in only one direction. While law enforcement waited for something obvious, everything meaningful was happening out of sight. No laws were being broken in public, no lines crossed that required intervention. The situation looked contained, even resolved, from the outside. Silence didn't just confuse enemies, it exhausted institutional attention. Without noise, there was nothing to chase. And once attention faded, Pressure disappeared with it. That created space. Space where outcomes could unfold without witnesses, paperwork, or interference. What followed didn't look like retaliation because retaliation is loud by design. This was quieter. Pressure was applied in places no one photographed and no reports ever mentioned. Conversations ended abruptly. Doors that once opened easily stayed closed. Support that had been assumed was suddenly unavailable. Nothing was said directly. Nothing needed to be. Influence moved through relationships, obligations, and unspoken understandings that didn't leave evidence behind. Money didn't change hands in obvious ways. Favors weren't demanded out loud. But the ground beneath the threat began to soften, then give way. People connected to it felt the shift before they could explain it. Plans stalled, confidence drained. The certainty that had fueled the original message evaporated without confrontation. That was the unsettling part. There was no enemy to point to, no action to respond against. Pressure like this doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need resistance to succeed. It works by narrowing options until the only remaining choice is retreat. And by the time that realization set in, the threat had already begun collapsing under its own weight. The damage didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, piece by piece, and that was what made it impossible to defend against. No one could point to a single moment where things went wrong. There was no confrontation to rally around, no accusation to deny, no enemy to face directly. Support thinned first. Calls stopped being returned. Familiar faces became distant. People who had once spoken confidently began avoiding the subject altogether. Exposure didn't come through violence. It came through absence, the kind that forces questions without offering answers. Being left without a fight stripped away something essential: justification. There was no story to tell, no wrong to point at publicly. That isolation carried its own weight. Reputation weakened not because it was attacked, but because it was allowed to stand alone. This was the cost of being seen without being challenged. When no one pushes back, it becomes clear who stands on real ground and who was relying on noise to stay upright. The threat lost its shape, not through force, but through quiet separation. And once exposed that way, recovery was nearly impossible. By the time the consequences became noticeable, no one was eager to interrupt them. From the outside, nothing appeared urgent. There were no public threats, no visible clashes, no disorder spilling into the streets. What was happening didn't look like a crisis. It looked like things settling on their own. That perception mattered. Authorities and outsiders respond to instability, not to quiet resolution. Without noise, there was no clear reason to step forward, no moment that demanded intervention. The situation felt contained, even if no one could fully explain why. Uncertainty discouraged involvement. No one wanted to insert themselves into something they didn't understand or couldn't control. There was also a quieter calculation at work. Order, however it was achieved, had been preserved. No headlines, no unrest, no pressure from above to act. In that environment, distance felt safer than interference. So nothing happened. Not because no one noticed, but because no one wanted responsibility for disrupting an outcome that appeared inevitable. Silence, once again, created its own protection. The end didn't arrive with confrontation. It arrived with absence. Calls stopped. Messages went unanswered. People who had once moved confidently through Harlem began avoiding familiar paths. The threat didn't explode. It dissolved. What collapsed wasn't just a plan, but belief. The belief that fear alone could hold ground. The belief that attention would protect them. The belief that silence meant weakness. One by one, those assumptions failed, and without them, there was nothing left to stand on. No announcement marked the end. No victory was claimed. The message simply stopped circulating. The symbols disappeared. The pressure that had been applied quietly did its work and then withdrew, leaving nothing to respond to. That was the most unsettling part. There was no moment to learn from, no clear mistake to correct, just the realization that the threat no longer mattered, and no one was willing to revive it. By the time anyone acknowledged what had happened, it was already over, not defeated in public, not punished in spectacle, just removed from relevance. And in that world, irrelevance was the final consequence. When it was over, there was nothing official left behind, no reports to file, no statements to contradict, no evidence that required follow-up. From the perspective of paperwork, nothing had happened at all. And in systems that rely on records to justify action, that absence mattered more than intent. Police work depends on visibility, complaints, witnesses, escalation. None of those existed anymore. The threat had vanished without triggering the kind of response that forces documentation. What couldn't be proven couldn't be pursued, and what couldn't be pursued quickly lost priority. That vacuum wasn't accidental. It was the result of control exercised away from attention. By the time anyone might have asked questions, there were no clear answers to demand, no timeline to reconstruct, no incident to anchor suspicion. So the file stayed thin. And thin files don't move. They get set aside, buried under louder problems that leave clearer trails. In that quiet space, responsibility dissolved, because without records, there was nothing left to act on. From the outside, what followed looked like calm. No protests, no retaliatory violence, no sudden spike that demanded attention. Streets stayed quiet. Businesses opened and closed on time. For anyone watching from a distance, order appeared intact. That appearance mattered more than the truth behind it. Authorities have always been drawn to disruption, not resolution. When things settle on their own, even for the wrong reasons, intervention feels unnecessary. Stability becomes the priority, regardless of how it was achieved. In this case, the absence of visible conflict was interpreted as success. No one asked too many questions because nothing demanded answers. Whatever pressure had been applied worked without spilling into public view. That made it convenient. Silence saved resources. Silence avoided complications. Silence allowed everyone in power to move on. Order, once preserved, becomes its own justification. And when order exists without noise, it is often protected, not challenged. That is how situations like this close quietly, not because they are understood, but because they no longer disrupt the surface. What followed exposed a truth many preferred not to say out loud. Justice and stability are not the same thing, and when they conflict, stability is often chosen first. There was no formal resolution, no accountability that could be pointed to with certainty. But there was quiet, and quiet to those in authority often feels like success. Justice requires questions. Stability prefers none. Asking how the threat disappeared would have meant reopening tensions, drawing lines, and admitting that control had shifted outside official channels. That kind of clarity creates responsibility. Silence removes it. The absence of violence made it easy to accept the outcome without examining it. No one could argue that the streets were worse off. No numbers justified intervention. The situation no longer demanded action, only acceptance. In moments like this, justice becomes abstract, something acknowledged but postponed. Stability, on the other hand, is immediate and visible. And when forced to choose, institutions often protect what keeps the surface calm, even if it means looking away from how that calm was achieved. Those 8 days proved something most people never understand until it's too late. Power doesn't need to be visible to be absolute. Nothing dramatic marked the end. No arrests, no speeches, no public reckoning. And yet the threat never returned, not in whispers, not in symbols, not in memory. What happened during that time rewrote expectations. It showed that patience could disarm provocation, that restraint could outmaneuver hatred, and that silence, used deliberately, could erase danger without feeding it. The absence of retaliation denied the threat the reaction it depended on to survive. Those days also revealed a harder truth. Protection doesn't always look like justice, and safety doesn't always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it comes through decisions no one sees and outcomes no one claims. In the end, nothing needed to be said because the result spoke for itself. The threat vanished, Harlem stayed standing, and the lesson remained unspoken but clear. The most effective response is often the one that leaves no story behind, only the certainty that something decisive took place.